Welcome back, everybody, to my advanced programming course using C++. Today we're going to talk about reference variables. So we're getting into a more advanced territory about functions and writing functions and passing things around. We're going to look at a use case where perhaps you want to modularize your steps. So for example, let me draw this out a bit. You want to have maybe a module here that gets input. Then you want to have another module here that does some calculation, right? And all this is going to be inside your main, right? Because the main is the center of it all. Now, how do I do that? Well, obviously we're going to write two functions, right? We're going to write one function that's going to get data from input, and then we're also going to write another function that will do the calculation. So whenever we write functions, now that we're learning how to write functions, is we always want to modularize things or separate things so that not a lot is going on in one function. I mean, I could easily create one function that can do the input and the calculation, right? But then what would be the point? What you want to do is you want to learn how to look at a problem and divide it up. And we start with the most simplest case, and then as you get through and start practicing more, once you get to the most difficult cases, you're going to find that by dividing and conquering, it's the best way to solve a problem. Okay, so let's have at it. Now, why does this have to do with reference variables? Well, what you want to do is, remember, so far our function parameters have been what we call pass by value, right? So pass by value, right? Which means that pass by value, you're making a copy. Which means that if you modify the variable inside the function, nothing's going to happen to the caller's value of that variable, right? So let's say I was going to create a variable called, we'll just call it value, so value is declared in main, and if you pass it in to my get input function, remember, when you get input, you're going to modify this variable, right? Once we come out of get input, value will not change because it's a pass by value. So that's the purpose of this lecture, is we want to find a way where if we pass a variable into a function, the modification will take place. And that's what we're here for. Okay, so let's take a look at my simple example here. Okay, I want you to focus on the top, which are my prototypes. So I created two prototypes. One is to get num, that's my input, right? And then my ref num, it's just my calculation that I'm going to do. In this example, you may notice something different about the prototype. The prototype has an ampersand. The ampersand is the key that is on, if you look at a keyboard, it's Shift 7. So if you type in Shift 7, you're going to get an ampersand. So what's the meaning of an ampersand? So this is what I was talking about. Once you pass in, you have a parameter that has an ampersand. We're going to call this pass by reference, which basically means that anything that you pass into this function, if the function modifies the variable, it's also going to be modified outside the function. So for example, right now, if we look at line 6, right? Line 6 has a variable called value. Now, we call the function called getNum, and we pass in value, right? In this case, instead of making a copy, because it's a pass by reference, it's not going to make a copy. It's actually going to pass in the reference of value, which means that if I go down here, see my variable here, right? It has a different variable name, but it doesn't really matter. It's still the same reference. So bear with me here. When I change user input, right? This is going to modify user input, which in turn is the reference that was passed in, which was my value variable. So when I get to line 9, okay, over here, let's say I entered 10. So that means that value is equal to 10, because if I look at my statements here, this is modifying user input variable, which in turn is really whatever the user passed in terms of the programmer, right? By calling the function with the argument, right? So we modified this and we entered 10. Now, because it's a pass by reference, on line 9, which really there's no code there, the value will be 10. And then once I go into my refnum, again, that is a pass by reference variable. We're also going to modify value, right? So if we go back here, and what we're doing here is we're multiplying it by 2, basically doubling it, right? So by the time I get out of line 10, which is my function call, over here, we are going to have the value of 20 because it got modified. So the ampersand gives you the right to modify, or the function the right to modify whatever you passed in. Now, obviously, if you pass in a literal, okay, that's not going to fly, right? You can't pass in a literal because it just doesn't make sense, right? You would need to pass in a variable here. So generally, when we are talking about pass by reference, you're going to be expected to pass in a variable, not any type of literal. Obviously, also, you cannot pass in a constant because a constant cannot be changed, right? So let's run this real quick, and then we can take a look at the graph. Okay, so enter a number, right? So right now we're on line 8, which in a sense we're at line 19 because we're calling get num. We're entering a number. We're going to enter the value 15. When I enter the value 15 and I press enter, right, value will be modified, right? Value will be modified. And then we're going to call my refnum, which is essentially going to double the value times 2, right? So by the end, you should see that the value doubled is 30. So let's try that. And there you go, right? So the value doubled is 30. So again, what's happening here is we have now a way to modify data that is coming into a function. And that's very powerful, and at the same time, it could be a little bit messy because you have to keep track of what functions can modify what. And again, there are situations where you may need to, but you should only do pass by reference if the use case really forces you to do it. So for example, when you want to separate input, I think it's a good idea to pass in variables by reference because you're going to be asking for input in a function, but you also want to make sure that whatever value got entered, you want to pass that value to other functions so they can modify it as well. Okay? So again, it all depends on the use case. And as you go through and look at problems, don't go pass by reference crazy. You should try and limit yourself to not looking at every single solution to be passed by reference, because then you're going to get yourself in trouble for that. Okay, so now let's take a look at the how the compiler is looking at this in terms of pass by reference. Okay, so imagine you have main, right? This big box is main. And then inside main, you're going to have multiple variables you're going to declare. In this case, we've declared value, right? Which is, doesn't really matter the data type. We made it int, okay? Now, inside main, we're giving a call to get num. Okay, so what's actually happening here? What's actually happening is you are giving a reference to get num, the parameter itself. And what is that reference? Well, it's really an address. Remember, when you declare value, let's say value is somewhere in address 3123, right? So when you make a copy, when you're doing pass by value, the address really doesn't matter because you just really want the value of the variable, right? But when you're doing pass by reference, what's happening is the compiler is saying, okay, so this is value, right? Now we have two things that we need to keep track of: the address of where it is in memory, and then the contents. Right now the contents is nothing because when we declared value, we just declared it and didn't do anything. So step one is this. Now we call getNum, right? Now getNum has a different name, right, for the parameter, right? And that doesn't matter really. Why doesn't it matter? Because what's happening is there is some type of copying going on, but it's not what you think. This address here is now going to be set to reference number. So if we look in memory somewhere, okay, somewhere over here, we have refnum. We have an address field. And then we also have contents, right? So if I modify, okay, well, first we're going to copy the address. So we're copying the address, right? So again, refnum is taking up the same address as value that was passed in. So that now has the same address. It's kind of like going to a house, right? And you go, you have the keys to that house. So if somebody else, if you give the keys to somebody else, it's going to be the keys to the same house, right? So I give you the keys to my house, and then if you go into my house, you can change anything you want. Okay, so that's what really the concept of pass by reference is. I have the keys to my house, so value has the keys to their house, right, which is the address. Now we're going to pass it into a function. So now I'm going to give you the keys to the house, which is the address, right? 3123. Now you can go and modify whatever is in that house, right? Which means that when we get out, if we modified refnum, right, it just has another name for it. But if you modify it, so let's say the contents change to 5, then this is also going to change to 5 because they have the same address. Where versus if you did pass by value, the parameter variable did not have the same address as the one that the argument that's coming in, right? So that's what makes it different when you're calling a function, okay, is that the addresses match. Now, once you gave in that ampersand, which is a pass by reference, anything you do to refnum is also going to be modified by whatever you pass in, which in this case is value. So that's why when you do a cin, right, and you do refnum, right? Refnum, again, address is 3123. I entered 15, right? So 15 went here, and it also went here because they have the same address, right? Now, why, you're probably asking, well, why don't you just name refnum value? You can, okay? Usually we do not because it's understood that the scope okay, of this variable called refnum is only within this function, even though if you change the variable, it's also going to change the argument that came in. Okay, and then that's understood. That is understood that when you change the value, that if it's passed by reference, it's also going to. But the refnum does not exist outside the scope of getNum. Okay, and value does not exist outside the scope of main. But although their scope doesn't exist, we can still change the variable value, the contents. Okay? Okay. So hopefully that kind of give you a good perspective on what's actually happening behind the covers. It all has to do with addresses. That's all really, if it all comes down to an address. So what's happening here is, again, we're passing in an address, and then when we modify the value of the parameter, because it's the same address, right, then it gets modified not only in the local variable of the function, but it also gets modified to the caller, okay, because they're essentially pointing to the same address. Okay? Okay, so I will see you on the next video, and I hope you enjoyed this one and you learned quite a bit on pass by reference.